Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. I'm your host, Mr. Hutchings. I'm a high school history teacher, bringing my topics from the classroom to the podcast, both for the benefits of students and history enthusiasts alike. Today's topic is the Prague Spring of 1968. I'm approaching this topic today as a Cold War conflict or Cold War hotspot. And Cold War hotspots tend to be a common theme for study in the IBDP Paper 2 history topic of superpowers and tensions. However, this topic today is being provided to a pre-DP class, and they're going to study the Prague Spring, but with the use of sources. So they're going to take a paper 1 approach of source style analysis with the Prague Spring as a topic. Now, for those who are listening as history enthusiasts, this is probably a little bit irrelevant to you, but the topic today is just going to be the background of the Prague Spring of 1968, so students in this classroom can do well on their source-based assessment. All right, so let's begin with the Prague Spring in 1968. I'm going to deliver this to you in different segments, or hopefully I can chunk this down into understandable parts. And it is meant for people with no prior background on the Prague Spring.
You're listening to Mr. Hutchings History, where history comes alive.
So beginning with segment 1, Cold War in Europe, the world behind the Iron Curtain. We're exploring how unique historical contexts like Soviet domination shaped the Czech desire for reform. Imagine you're walking the cobbled streets of Prague in 1968. You hear the clink of coffee cups in cafes. People are talking about politics openly. Jazz music drifts out of a record store. Something is changing. But not far from here, thousands of tanks are rumbling toward your city. To understand why, we need to rewind. After World War II, Europe was split by ideology, not just geography. On one side, the United States and its capitalist allies. On the other, the Soviet Union, promoting communism and control. This invisible division became known as the Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill in 1946. Czechoslovakia was swept behind that curtain in 1948, but this did not happen overnight. At first, the country tried to restore its pre-war democracy. In the 1946 elections, the Communist Party won a large share of the vote, but not a majority. However, they controlled key positions in the police and security forces. As tensions rose during the early Cold War, the Communists took advantage of a political crisis in February 1948. This crisis began when non-communist ministers in Czechoslovakia, in the coalition government, resigned en masse, hoping to force new elections and curb growing communist influence, especially in the Ministry of Interior, which controlled the police. Instead of stepping down, the communists mobilized mass demonstrations, took over radio stations, and filled the streets with pro-communist labor unions. Under immense pressure and fearing Soviet military intervention, President Edvard Benes accepted a new government composed entirely of Communist Party members. In February 1948, they staged what is known as a coup d'etat. Non-communist ministers were forced to resign. President Edvard Benes, under pressure from both internal forces and Stalin's Soviet Union, allowed a new communist-dominated government to take over. Within months, opposition parties were banned, elections were manipulated, and censorship began. Czechoslovakia had become a one-party state, not through invasion, but through intimidation, fear, and Soviet backing. Over the next 20 years, the Czech people lived under tight censorship. All newspapers, books, and broadcasts were monitored by the state. Foreign publications were banned, and even jokes critical of the government could result in punishment. Czech people lived under political purges. Thousands of officials, academics, and ordinary citizens were arrested, imprisoned, or removed from their jobs if they were seen as ideologically unreliable. Show trials and forced confessions became common in the 1950s. Czech people lived under a planned economy focused on Soviet needs. The Czech government set production targets for factories and farms. Consumer goods were scarce, quality was poor, and innovation was stifled. Much of Czechoslovakia's industrial output was redirected to fulfill Soviet military and economic demands. These conditions mirrored those in other Eastern Bloc states like East Germany, Poland, and Hungary. However, Czechoslovakia's relatively educated and industrial population made dissatisfaction more intense, especially among students and intellectuals. In Hungary, in 1956, a reform movement led by Prime Minister Imre Nagy tried to withdraw the country from the Warsaw Pact and establish a multi-party democracy, an attempt that paralleled Dubček's efforts a decade later. It began with student protests and quickly turned into a nationwide uprising. Nagy announced Hungary's neutrality, meaning that Hungary would no longer align itself with either the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc or the US-led Western Alliance. But within days, the Soviet Union sent tanks to crush the movement in Hungary. Thousands were killed, and Nagy was later executed. Like in Prague, the Hungarian people had hoped to create a more independent and more open socialist society, but Moscow responded with overwhelming force. In East Germany, the Stasi secret police created a deeply fearful atmosphere. While each state had unique elements, the overall pattern of repression and control was consistent throughout the Soviet sphere. Dissent meant danger. Books were banned. Phone calls were tapped, and travel outside the Eastern Bloc nearly impossible. But history is never still. By the 1960s, pressure was building, and it was building from below. Students were demanding greater intellectual freedom. Writers and journalists were frustrated by censorship. Economists criticized the inefficiencies of central planning. Even within the Communist Party itself, reform-minded members began calling for change. These reformers within the Communist Party were not calling for a return to capitalism, but for a version of socialism that allowed more openness, efficiency, and dignity. They wanted less censorship, more transparency in governance, and some limited decentralization of economic planning. This push for reform gained momentum in the 1960s, partly because Stalin, who had brutally crushed all dissent, had died in 1953. While repression remained, Khrushchev's later denunciation of Stalin's crimes opened the door for cautious criticism across the Eastern Bloc. In Czechoslovakia, a relatively educated and urbanized population, a poor consumer economy, and frustration with the rigid bureaucracy made calls for reform especially urgent by the end of the decade. The pressure was directed at the rigid, Moscow-loyal leadership in Prague, and it reflected a growing desire to modernize Czechoslovak socialism and to respond to public dissatisfaction with daily life.
A podcast is only as useful as the notes you take. Write this down.
Segment 2. Enter Dubček, Reform from Within. Here we're following how Dubček's vision became the central idea of the Prague Spring, shaped by political and cultural change. Enter Alexander Dubček, a Slovak politician who had grown up under communism but hadn't lost his idealism. In January 1968, he became first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, the most powerful post in the country. Unlike his predecessors, Dubček didn't want to destroy socialism. He wanted to renew it. His vision, socialism with a human face. This meant ending press censorship. Dubček argued that open criticism would strengthen socialism by identifying its weaknesses, not undermine it. It also meant allowing limited political debate. He believed socialism should reflect the people's will and encouraged broader participation in public life. It also meant reforming the economy for more local control. Dubček justified decentralization as a way to boost efficiency and address the economic stagnation caused by rigid, centralized planning. Socialism with a face, human face, also meant granting religious and cultural freedoms. He maintained that true socialism would and should allow space for diverse traditions and intellectual growth, not suppress them. The centerpiece of this movement was the Action Program, a policy launched in April 1968. The Action Program promised legal reforms to ensure fairer trials. Dubček believed that justice should reflect socialist values of fairness and equality, not political loyalty. Courts needed to serve the people, not the Communist Party. The Action Program also promised freedom of movement to travel to the West. Dubček argued that travel restrictions created distrust and stagnation. Allowing people to travel would build confidence in the system and expose citizens to new ideas without abandoning socialism. The Action Program also promised new trade opportunities. Dubček saw limited economic openness as a way to modernize industry, improve consumer goods, and reduce dependence on Soviet planning. And lastly, the Action Program also promised recognition of Slovak autonomy within the Czech Federation. By promoting national equality within socialism, Dubček aimed to show that socialism could adapt to the diverse and cultural and regional needs of its citizens, putting a more humane, inclusive face on the system. Newspapers printed real opinions. Satirical plays returned to the stage. These performances openly mocked the absurdities of government bureaucracy, the blind obedience demanded by the Communist Party, and the gray, joyless nature of daily life under authoritarian rule. Playwrights like Václav Havel used irony and dark humor to expose the contradictions within the system. For example, how slogans about freedom masked surveillance, and how official truth often contradicted lived reality. These plays had been banned or censored for years, and their return was seen as a sign that real change might be possible. Banned books reappeared, including philosophical works, Western novels, and critical essays long forbidden by the regime. Titles like George Orwell's Animal Farm and 1984, once labeled subversive, became widely circulated. Works by Czech authors who had been blacklisted, such as Milan Kundera's early fiction or Ludvík Vasulik's political commentaries, were published again. These books challenged official ideology and helped people imagine alternative political futures. People debated ideas freely in public, not just about government policy, but also about economic reforms, artistic freedom, the role of religion in public life, and the moral failures of Stalinism. For example, intellectual circles questioned whether socialism could survive without democratic accountability, while students debated the legitimacy of Soviet domination. Others discussed whether Czechoslovakia should open trade and cultural ties with the West, and how far reform should go without provoking Soviet retaliation. These conversations were once unthinkable, and now they spilled into cafes, classrooms, and even radio call-in programs, some for the first time in their lives.
If you're revising for IB/AP or A-levels, this episode is your new study partner.
Segment 3, Moscow watches. The superpower strikes back. While Prague was blooming with new ideas, Moscow was growing nervous. Leonid Brezhnev, leader of the Soviet Union, worried that Dubček's reforms would spread like wildfire across the Eastern Bloc. If Czechoslovakia slipped, what about Poland, East Germany, Bulgaria? In April 1970, Brezhnev would describe the Prague Spring this way: the anti socialist conspiracy in Czechoslovakia was a long planned attempt to destroy the foundations of the socialist system. The Soviets feared this was not a reform, it was a counter revolution. Brezhnev believed that Dubček's reforms, though framed as improvements, undermined the core pillars of the socialist system: the leading role of the Communist Party, centralized economic control, and ideological unity. Allowing freedom of the press, public criticism, and political diversity threatened to erode the party's authority and legitimacy. Brezhnev saw these reforms as opening the door to Western influence, weakening the socialist bloc, and potentially encouraging similar movements in Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. In his view, once a socialist state permitted pluralism or loosened central control, it risked falling into chaos, or worse, capitalism. Thus, the reforms were not seen as adjustments, but as existential threats to the Soviet model itself.
Let's turn the page. New chapter coming up.
Segment 4: The Invasion, Tanks and Protest. This moment reveals the consequences of conflicting visions: reform within versus unity through control. On the night of August 20th to 21st, 1968, Soviet-led Warsaw Pact troops crossed into Czechoslovakia. Over 200,000 soldiers and 5,000 tanks rolled through borders and cities. The invasion had begun. Prague woke to fear and disbelief. People poured into the streets, not with weapons, but with courage. Students stood on top of tanks. Citizens painted over street signs confused the soldiers. The resistance was peaceful but powerful. One famous photograph shows young protesters surrounding a Soviet tank. No guns, no violence, just the Czech flag raised high. That image came to define the spirit of the Prague Spring. Dubček was arrested and flown to Moscow. In a chilling radio broadcast later that week, Dubček addressed the nation. His voice, though calm, was noticeably strained. He assured listeners that order would be restored, that the party would continue to guide the nation, and that socialism would be preserved. However, it was clear he was speaking under duress, not the confident reformer of a few months prior, but a man surrounded by Soviet handlers, reading a carefully crafted message. The broadcast was chilling to the Czech people because it symbolized the end of their brief experiment with freedom and reform. It confirmed what many feared, that their leader was no longer free to lead. Dubček had been arrested during the invasion and flown to Moscow along with several other Czech officials. There, Soviet leaders demanded that he reverse his reforms and sign agreements restoring strict communist control. Although Czechoslovakia was a sovereign state on paper, it was part of the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance dominated by the USSR. Brezhnev made it clear deviation from the Soviet model would not be tolerated, and Moscow held the ultimate authority over its satellite states.
Mr. Hutchings' History. Stories that shape the world, told for those shaping their future.
Segment 5: The Brezhnev Doctrine and Normalization. This segment helps trace how the Brezhnev Doctrine shaped political repression beyond Czechoslovakia and reinforced authoritarian unity in the region. After Dubček's return on August 27, 1968, Things changed quickly, and not for the better. He remained in office for a few months, but the writing was on the wall. Soviet officials monitored every move, and by April 1969, Dubček was forced to resign. A new hardline leader, Gustav Husak, was installed, and the process of normalization began. Normalization meant reversing everything the Prague Spring had stood for. Censorship was reimposed, cultural freedoms were shut down, reformers were fired or imprisoned, and the secret police expanded surveillance. Within months, the country resembled its pre 1968 state. Only now, the sense of betrayal ran deeper. Many Czechs felt profoundly disillusioned because the reformers had never seen themselves as revolutionaries. They were loyal socialists who believed in the core ideas of socialism, but wanted to improve it, to make it more democratic, more just, and more responsive to the needs of the people. They believed socialism could succeed with greater local control and individual freedoms. The Soviet invasion shattered this hope, sending the message that even well-intentioned, peaceful reform would be punished, not tolerated. To justify their intervention and reassert ideological control, the Soviets formally articulated the Brezhnev Doctrine. Announced in late 1968, it declared, "When forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of a socialist country toward capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of that country, but a common problem of all socialist countries." This doctrine established the Soviet Union's right to intervene in any social state if socialism itself was deemed at risk. What did this mean in practice? If a country like Czechoslovakia tried to reform too much, even peacefully, the USSR would step in. This had a chilling effect across the Eastern Bloc. In Poland and East Germany, reformers fell silent. In Hungary, memories of 1956 were revived. And across the West, hopes for a more open communism faded. Segment 6: Legacy, Resistance, and the Long View. This moment illustrates how the legacies of failed reform can shape long-term historical transformation, and how resistance adapts even under pressure. Even as the tanks rolled through the streets of Prague and reformers were silenced, the spirit of the Prague Spring lived on. Many Czechs, especially young people, found quiet ways to resist. Some joined underground cultural circles. Others smuggled books or listened to banned Western broadcasts like Radio Free Europe. Protest didn't disappear, it just went silent, underground, and symbolic. One of the most powerful acts of defiance came in January 1969. A university student named Jan Palahniuk walked into Wenceslas Square and set himself on fire. He left a letter behind demanding an end to censorship and the restoration of reforms. He died 3 days later. His funeral became a silent national protest. Palahniuk became a symbol of moral resistance. He wasn't alone. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, writers like Václav Havel continued to challenge the regime. The Charter 77 movement, signed by intellectuals, artists, and dissidents, demanded the government follow its own constitution and international human rights agreements. Though the regime dismissed them as traitors, these voices kept the memory of reform alive. And then, in 1989, the wall came down, literally and figuratively. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia was peaceful, student-led, and astonishingly swift. Václav Havel, once jailed for his plays, became president. The seeds of 1968 had finally bloomed, not in violence, but in determined hope.
Warning: may cause unexpected interest in history exams.
Segment 7: Review, Exam Practice, and Student Reflection. So let's take a moment to review and reflect on what we've learned. A quick review and key points to remember: the cause of the Prague Spring, long-standing dissatisfaction with political repression, economic inefficiency, and a lack of personal freedoms, as well as internal pressure from students, intellectuals, and reform-minded communist officials. The reform goals. The reform goals were freedom of speech and press, judicial fairness and local autonomy, economic modernization and openness. The Soviet reaction. The USSR feared ideological erosion and loss of control in the Eastern Bloc. Brezhnev viewed reforms as threats to unity and authority, not adjustments within socialism. And Soviet military force was used to reverse reforms. The aftermath and legacy: a return to hardline rule through normalization, emergence of underground resistance and moral protest, and long-term impact on the collapse of communism in 1989.
You're listening to Mr. Hutchings' History, where history comes alive.
Students can practice exam-style questions, whether for IB, IGCSE, or pre-DP assessments. Think of these questions. So what, according to Soviet leaders, was the dangers of Dubček's reforms? How can two sources be used to compare how each reflects the spirit of the Prague Spring? When you look at one source, usually probably an internal voice or Czechoslovakian voice, how do they reflect on the spirit of the Prague Spring? And when look at another source that reflects the voice or viewpoint of Moscow leadership, and how does Moscow leadership reflect upon the spirit of the Prague Spring? A third question you could practice with is when you're working with a source with a reference to its origin, purpose, and content, evaluate the value and limitations of a source. Got that classic OPCVL. And a good essay to practice with is: to what extent did the Soviet response to the Prague Spring reveal weaknesses within the Eastern Bloc? So when working with student reflections, imagine you are a 16-year-old living in Prague in late August 1968. You've just heard Dubček's radio address after the invasion, and think of yourself, you're in Prague. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What do you hope for? Trying to understand the emotional impact that the people of the Prague Spring experience. Feel free to write this as a diary entry or a short letter or even a poem to yourself, and try to recapture the spirit of the Prague Spring yourself. All right, so this is going to wrap up this session. The Prague Spring reminds us that even in the shadows of tanks, people will speak. And when voices rise together, even if briefly, they can echo through generations. Thanks for joining me on Mr. Hutchings' History. Until next time, keep asking why.